Same old man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to this podcast review for August 1st, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy, and JD, I like the way you open that almost operatically in some ways.
I tried.
Yeah.
You know, I tried really hard. This show is going to be a poem to everybody. We are not going to review this the way we normally do. We're going to do it all through haiku.
Oh, we're not doing that. No. I'm not prepared for that. No way. I'd rather sing the episode rather than just do it as a haiku.
We could dance. We could do an interpretive dance of.
We're not doing that either.
Fair enough.
I'm not sure where that was. A little flutteriness.
I don't know.
You almost
Look,
look like a puppet or something like that.
I'm
It looks
not
like you're trying to
Melissa-
mirror In Sync, no strings attached.
Maybe that's what it is. Look, I did take, this is a true story, 1 year of ballet, maybe 2, when I was younger, when I was about
Okay.
Sam's age, actually.
Okay.
And you know how I got tricked into this?
How's that?
Because I, of course, played a lot of sports growing up. And my mom, or it might have been my dad, I can't remember. I think it was my mom. But she was like, you know what? You know one of your favorite athletes, Jerry Rice?
Mm-hmm.
When he was a young kid, he took ballet, and that helped him with his footwork, and that's why he's such a great wide receiver. That was what was told to me. Now, if my dad is to be believed, and my dad is an encyclopedia when it comes to sports,
Yeah. You
and
mentioned that.
I say that without hyperbole. My dad is the kind of guy where I could go up to him and say, who was the left guard for the New York Giants in 1973? And without hesitation, he'll say, oh, his name was blah, blah, blah. He went to the University of Iowa. He was 6'6" and 300 pounds. Like, that's the kind of a guy that we're talking about. Like, that level of
That's
detail.
amazing. Yeah.
He's incredible like that. And so he's the one that has said, yes, that's a true story. So I don't know if that's true or not, but
I'm trying to look it
tend
up
to
now.
believe him. It might have just been something they made up to get me into this ballet class. I don't really know. But I accepted it as truth because I was like 6 or 7 or whatever. So I was young. I accepted it as truth. And I was like, yes, I want great footwork. I want to be like Jerry Rice. Even though I ended up not playing football, I switched to hockey. But
Yeah.
footwork is still very important.
Oh, it's
in hockey
very
as
important
well.
in that sport. Yeah.
You know, I would say that I'm a better skater than the average person on the street. I think is fair to say.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And that comes with, you know, a lot of practice and a lot of working on your footwork and all that sort of stuff. So at any rate, I did do ballet for a few years, and that as far as, you know, that's all the dancing that I did from when I was 7 and 8 years old. That's
Yeah.
that's all the I danced my way out of everything at that point.
Wow. And now I just want to see you
So-
dance. I want to see. I want to see somewhere in the middle of this episode, you just get up and start moonwalking back and forth.
Definitely, like this is all I got. This weird whatever Brendan articulated.
I don't know what that
if
is.
if you're listening to this, you just got to go to YouTube and watch it.
My first comparison was to say it's like no strings attached in sync, but honestly, I think that's giving it too much credit because I don't even know what that is now.
Yeah, like it's just evolved.
No
into-
offense. It's
Look, I am not a great dancer. I avoid that at all costs when I can.
yeah.
I am I am stereotypical Barbie when it comes to white guy can't dance. I am stereotypical white guy can't dance Barbie. That's who I am.
I'm kind of in the same boat. Yeah, I'm not much of a good dancer. I'm a good musician, and weirdly, I play a musical instrument that's all about groove,
Mhm.
and yet I have good timing, but not necessarily good dance moves. So it's I'm kind of with you in that regard. I'd rather play the music than dance to it.
Unless you put me on the ice, and then I am angelic and
All
can
of a sudden,
skate with the
a
wind.
figure skating routine ensues.
No, like figure skaters put me to shame. I can just, within the confines of hockey, that's where I'm great.
That's all you have.
That's
Okay.
how I'm a good skater within the confines of hockey.
We all have our own courts, figuratively speaking, that we know
Yeah.
how to handle very well.
Exactly. So that is to say, we're here to talk about Carmen.
Yeah, what a transition.
What
Well, Benjamin
Yeah.
Millepied, he's certainly working in his court with this one, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting because this is a film that I don't know if many people are aware of or that they've seen. I want to say that this played at the festivals last year. Is that when it premiered? I'm trying to
I honestly don't
find
remember.
the answer.
Which is, sadly proving your point.
Yeah, the film premiered at Toronto last September. But I think it played at maybe Sundance earlier or South by, I want to say as well.
Okay.
So this is a film that, it came through the festival circuit. I don't know if it had any sort of, I never came to a theater near me. I'll say that. I looked. I was actively looking because I heard good things. It stars Paul Mescal, and everyone, I think, is in love with Paul Mescal at the moment. He's about to blow up.
I think, this movie certainly lucked out because apparently he wasn't the first choice for Aiden in this movie. Apparently it was originally supposed to go to Jamie Dornan. And I think it was scheduling conflicts that made that impossible for Jamie. So it ended up going to Paul Mescal instead.
And what incredible timing.
Yeah.
This film definitely
Worked out in its
benefited.
favor. Yeah.
Yeah, worked out in its favor that Paul Mescal is in this film. So, of course, I was very excited to see this. It's got Melissa Barrera in it as well. And the other big thing is that we all heard about Nicholas Britell's score for this film, that it was really, really great. So I was looking forward to this, but it never came to Miami, not in a theater anyway. And so I had to just actively try to pay attention to when it was going to go to streaming, or that when it was available on VOD, so that way I could watch it. And then recently it did go to on demand.
Yep.
And I watched it and I told Brennan, please watch this. I want to talk about it. So, this isn't necessarily top of mind for a lot of people, but in a lot of ways, this is reminiscent of the old school extra film thing when Brennan and I did extra film before Ryan and Jay took over, where these little films would come out and I'd be like, hey, this sounds awesome. Let's add that to extra film.
And in some cases, you ended up watching it and you think to yourself, this is like really good. We need to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's how we got here.
Yeah.
So a lot of you listening, watching, you might not have seen it, or maybe you have. I don't really know, but I hope that it does eventually get to an audience for reasons we'll get to here shortly. But this is directed by Benjamin Millepied. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
I think that's how you pronounce it. I know that this is Natalie Portman's husband.
Forgive me. I should have looked that up before we started recording, but
I do believe it's
I have
Benjamin
2
Millepied.
kids.
Yeah.
So-
We'll go with that for now, but we can be corrected if we're mispronouncing that severely.
Absolutely. I apologize in advance if I am butchering that, but we will certainly talk about Mr. Millepied.
Yeah.
It stars, as we noted, Melissa Barrera and Paul Mescal, as well as Rossy del Palma. All right, let's just kind of get into this, Brennan. It's really hard to lay out what a plot synopsis is because plot, we'll say, is a little thin when it comes to this movie. I think the one thing that we can say is that this is inspired by the famous opera titled Carmen.
By Bizet, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's the last name.
Georges Bizet,
I
believe is who it is.
Are you familiar with the opera at all?
I'm not. No, I don't think so anyway.
I'm vaguely familiar with the opera. Not so much by its plot or its story. Rather, there are a few iconic melodies from the opera that I can say I've at least heard of.
Gotcha.
But that's really the extent of it.
Yeah. So I haven't really heard any of the original renderings of the opera or anything like that. I'm just vaguely familiar with it and what it's about.
Yeah.
And this is Benjamin Millepied's rendition of it.
Yeah.
With that said, with that laid out, Brendan, what did you think of Carmen?
And Benjamin Millepied's directorial debut, if I'm not mistaken. I know he's done a few short
See,
films.
now that makes sense because how many directorial debuts have we raved about on this show over the last few
It's
years?
kind of a common theme, right?
It's become
Yeah.
a trend.
I will say this. I don't know if I'm going to rave about the film like you might, because I feel like you're playing your cards pretty early that you really, really like this film. And I do like it quite a bit as well, primarily because it falls into this category of films that are just so ambitious that you just can't help but respect it, right?
Yeah.
This is very much kind of funneling. It's functioning as almost three different movies, right? Like at times it almost feels like this musical / opera. It also feels like a sociopolitical thriller and a romance and a mood piece, an ethereal mood piece. It's kind of funneling all through all of these different things. And there are a few occasions where the seams do show. Like at times it does feel like multiple types of movie. But each of those components are, for the most part, really well done. I think it functions best when it's really operating as this, as kind of a vibe, as a tone poem. Yeah, you were sort of alluding to this idea of the film being a tone poem at one point in our introduction. Yeah, but I think when it's working in that realm, it's at its best. And you know, this is obviously inspired by a classic opera. The setting and story have obviously changed to sort of mirror the current refugee crisis, especially between Mexico and California. So that's certainly part of it too. It has some sociopolitical themes on its mind for sure. And like I said, I think all of these different elements, I can kind of argue that they don't always mesh together, but in a weird way, I kind of like that they don't, because it shows a director who's just really going for it. And when the film is functioning as that tone poem and it gets really impressionistic, or when it's functioning as less of a musical and more of a ballet. Like there are no real traditional musical numbers here. Most of the music itself and even some of the sung pieces are actually in the background. They're more incorporated within the score. And most of it's more based on movement and dance and interpretation, which is a really interesting way to go about it. So you can tell that Benjamin Millepied comes from a very stage-oriented background, and he brings that to this film. And it makes for a very unique experience. And like I said, I don't think it'll end up as one of my favorites of the year, but it was certainly the most fascinated I was watching something this year, because I've not seen anything like it this year, and I don't think I will. And whether it trips over its ambitions or not, I kind of like that it sometimes does trip over those ambitions, because it shows a director really going for it. And I found those sequences in a vacuum so cool.
Yeah, I'm not even going to pretend to have some sort of setup. I think this is one of the most beautiful films I've seen this year.
I knew that was coming.
This hypnotic and ethereal experimental musical that had me utterly entranced the entire time. And I think it's important to emphasize, once again, as you're talking about there, Brennan, that there is really not much of a narrative here. It's a modern day reimagining of the Bizet opera we talked about that functions as this tone poem. And I'm going to do it, Brendan. I've avoided this before in the past, but I'm going right for the jugular here. It is very Millepied in its presentation.
There it is. It is.
Visuals and music do most of the heavy lifting. Nicholas Britell's elegant score here is nothing short of sublime. It's utterly mesmerizing and so vital to the film's lucid emotion and pulsating romance. And then there's Jörg Widmer's cinematography, and oh my God, every frame in this film is strikingly lush and evocative. It is easily one of the most exquisite looking movies of the year.
Agreed.
Everything about it is hauntingly detailed, and there's something about the desolate, grimy backdrop of Texas and then also California that dissolves bleak hopelessness into beautiful and romantic ambition.
Yeah.
And you know what that reminded me of, speaking of Malick, the Tree of Life.
Yeah.
And guess who was on the camera crew for that movie?
Oh, it was Jörg Widmer, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, he was
no
also the
coincidence there.
primary cinematographer of A Hidden Life, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Absolutely. So he knows Millepied very well. This is a movie.
But that's the thing. Like I want to jump in quickly if you don't mind. We are using the term Malikian here, and we're kind of being more literal with that comparison because of your Winmer's history working with Terrence Malick. But this doesn't feel like a Malick copycat, right? It doesn't. It still functions kind of like its own thing for the most part.
Yeah. Oh,
And that's something I want to make it clear that that's not what we're saying. We're not pleased by the
Yeah.
fact that it's reminding us of Malick, but it does have some of those tropes to kind of build upon them for its own vision.
No, absolutely. I think that's why calling this a poem, and maybe more specifically a ballet,
Yeah,
that I think is a nice, distinctive describer that's different from something that
this
I would say is
absolutely is a ballet.
Malikian.
Yeah,
This is very much a ballet where dancing and choreography is front and center, but and even song, but it also has those poetic qualities that come with Malick, where again visuals are front and center, and the visuals here are striking, not verbatim from Malick, but striking and lush. The score does a lot of the heavy lifting, as we see in Malick films, but there's also the editing and sound mixing, which I think is noteworthy in Malick films. That's also a big component to this film. And then there's the performances. There's Paul Mescal and Melissa Barrera, who are really great, and I love their evolving chemistry as the film unfolds. Admittedly, I haven't seen any of her work prior to In the Heights, so all I know Barrera from is that, and of course her work in the Scream films. And this is wildly different from those movies. And it's a side of her I just haven't seen yet. But my God, I think she is excellent here. She moves with this enchanting grace and has as much of a relationship with the camera as she does Paul Mescal's character of Aiden. The subtle mannerisms in her performance, the fluidity of her dancing and choreography, the emotional texture she conveys, it's astounding work. Mescal is equally worthy, and I love his rugged charm in this film. Rossy de Palma is noteworthy with her performance.
MVP for me right there.
Not only for her exterior elegance and work with Barrera, but she provides the voiceover narration that amplifies the emotional heft of this film. And did I mention Malick? Have you heard about his voiceover narration?
That's the thing. Yeah. I mean, his movies are prayers. That's how his movies function.
Absolutely. So, and look, I'm bringing that up as a good thing. This is, if anything, I don't know if Malick was specifically top of mind for Millepied, but if it is, this is him honoring the craft that Malick tends to bring in his films, but doing it in a different way that I really love. So, we can certainly get into, what all of this means. Honestly, I think there's so much to parse there that I don't know if I fully have.
I don't even know if I have the energy to go through that exercise because there's so much to parse. Because there's kind of nothing to parse in some ways too.
Well, and that's what makes it interesting.
It's so subtle in its presentation, which is interesting to say because it's actually a very grand and hypnotic movie as we're talking about. But anything that it's doing thematically or even emotionally, it's sort of up to us to try to uncover that, right? Yes. Like I did mention that there are some sociopolitical themes here, especially as it tries to change its sense of place to be around the refugee crisis. So that's certainly part of it as well. It might not be the biggest talking point, but it is certainly part of the DNA of this reimagining. One thing I did want to ask you, and I'm genuinely curious about this, and I'm not really asking this as a knock on the film, but there is a version of this movie that I think I would have maybe preferred. How would you have felt if this was, in some ways, a silent film, where maybe the only voicing that we actually heard were those moments of voiceover narration, anytime characters sing, or anytime the score or original songs are played in the background, but the actual dialogue itself that carries parts of the plot were completely nixed. How would you feel about that?
I'll be honest. I don't think it would have changed all that much for me because there's no plotting to this film, or there's vague plotting, and most of that is driven by action and not dialogue. There's
Yeah.
very little dialogue in this film to begin with. And,
Right.
you know, so if this functioned as a silent film, I don't think much would change for me, because there's not enough dialogue here to make that much of a
Yeah.
difference. And the dialogue that is here isn't all that significant to its grander
Well,
ideas and
That
execution.
that's what I was feeling as well, and that's interesting to hear you say that because I do agree. And honestly, it's the moments of dialogue, which admittedly not many, few and far between, right? But I do think those moments of dialogue are the weakest elements of the film, and it's because it does start to feel like the seams between all of these different aesthetic choices start to show. It slowly kind of feels like a different movie for just a moment. And to be perfectly honest, I think these performances, especially from Melissa Barrera, I think she's at her best when she is channeling her, her theater roots, right? When she's focusing more on the musicality, the physical choreography, because in those moments, she is quite magnetic. But I did sense a slight stiffness in the moments of dialogue between characters that I do think this movie could have been more effective for me if it was simply conveyed through backing music, Nicholas Britell's score, just facial expressions to carry this, because that's really all this is meant to function as. And I think that would have added maybe just a little bit more consistency to the final product. But thankfully, those moments of dialogue that help carry the plot even a little bit are so few and far between, it doesn't really matter in the long run. But I do think those are the few moments for me that did kind of halt the movie at times. But it doesn't happen very often, as I said.
Okay. Yeah, I very much did not feel that way.
Okay. Okay.
Like at all. I did not
Interesting.
have that
Interesting.
experience with this film. Again, partially because I was not I didn't really care about the dialogue here because the film doesn't really care all that much. It includes some of it to get us from A to B to C. But I will say this about the dialogue. I don't think that it's simply there to be there. I think when this film is emphasizing some of that dialogue, and maybe it's because of the performances more than anything else, but I also harken back to the score and the visuals. I will always go back to that with this film because those two things, as well as the editing, I want to give the editing and sound its props as well, because that is a big part of this movie. But the technicalities of this film are what drive it more than anything else. And those things are vividly there even when these characters are having simple conversations. And these performances are, I think, are so good that even when they're having these little conversations, I didn't find it stiff at all. If anything, I love the subtlety of it. This isn't melodramatic by any means. And again, if I'm going to compare this to Malick, I might as well go all the way, because I think about something like The Tree of Life or even A Hidden Life, and some of the more striking scenes of those movies are characters having dialogue and talking. I think of Brad Pitt at the table with his kids and what he's saying there, or some of the conversations he has about his sons later on in the film that are so goddamn moving.
I agree there. Yeah.
And this film's dialogue isn't striving for that same kind of emotional prowess,
Right.
but the performances are there to deliver credence to what those characters are doing in those scenes. And if we want to talk about maybe some of that emotional underbelly, I think of the moment of Adrian when he calls his sister at the end of the film, and the great subtlety of Mescal there. But there's also this over emotion that is equally there. And I found all of that riveting, or the conversations that Carmen has with the Palma character. What was her name? Masilda.
Masilda. Yeah.
When they're having those conversations, there's like this weird awkwardness at first, but eventually as those two characters connect, you see the emotional vulnerability of Carmen really become exposed in ways that I think is interesting. So the dialogue of this film is so minuscule that it has very little effect on its overall grandness and poetry. But I do think that when it is there, it's not there just to be there. It's not there
No, it's not
as
there
like
just to be there. I agree.
as something to, give us a vague idea of what's happening. I do think that Millepied, the writing, and these performances, they still offer love and craft to those moments in this film.
The way you're talking about it there, I think you helped me pinpoint why I maybe felt a slight stiffness in those moments that were exclusively dialogue heavy. Because you brought up two key scenes where I actually didn't even notice the stiffness in the talkiness. The one being that phone call, the payphone scene between Paul Mescal's Aiden is his character name, I
Aiden,
believe.
yeah.
Aiden, yeah.
Yeah.
And when he calls his sister, that scene's great. Or really any scene involving Rossy de Palma. Rossy de Palma, her name is, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Again, I think she might be the MVP here. And they do get very direct dialogue scenes, and those scenes do work for me. I think the reason why I felt the stiffness is, you might push back on this. In those scenes of dialogue, I just don't think Melissa Barrera is very good. I think she's way better at the physicality and the musicality of the sequences that she really stands out. She has a musical number towards the end that she actually full on sings, and it is absolutely gorgeous. But maybe the stiffness I was feeling was more in her performance than it was in the actual writing itself. To be honest, I think her, like, from a dialogue and character banter standpoint, I think she's actually more effective in Scream 6, if I'm being honest. But it's also a very different type of performance. You can't really be comparing the two, obviously. But yeah, maybe she's the reason why I was a little apprehensive about those scenes really working. Maybe why I noticed it a bit more. Because I do think Paul Mescal is an example of someone that actually does handle it very well. So maybe it's more of a performance thing. I don't know.
Yes, we are going to talk about one of my favorite things about this movie.
Okay.
Thank you for this transition, Brendan.
You're
I
welcome.
really appreciate you.
You're welcome, I think.
Because what you're talking about is something that I love about this film. You criticize her for being stiff. I praise her for this emotional evolution that we see with the character.
I
it's
didn't feel it as
interesting how
much.
we see the same thing in different ways, because I go back to how there's something about the film's poetry and sense of myth that feels so timeless as it relates to love and loss, which is, of course, the heart of the classic tale. And those emotional beats, I do think, are evocative here. However, I couldn't help but wonder if Millepied had something more on his mind with how modernized this is. And from what I've read, these characters and their relationships are very different from the Bizet opera. And maybe that idea is, while you made a good point earlier, there's certainly some political tension at play here that we could talk about. But I think that's mostly in the backdrop. I don't think that's really...
It's not really about that, but that's
it's not really
certainly
about that.
part of the DNA.
Absolutely. The refugee crisis, it's all part of the DNA of what's driving these characters from a superficial perspective. However, when we look below that, maybe what's driving this film, and especially Carmen, more than anything else, my favorite C word, closure.
Okay.
A little bit of closure. And I just find that really interesting, given what we see with Carmen at the beginning of the film, what she experiences there. And yes, it does render her a little emotionally rugged, and she doesn't trust anyone as she goes on this journey. Even Aiden, early on, she doesn't really trust him at all, and that tension, I think, is compelling. But as the film evolves and they form, again, very poetically, not conventionally at all, but they form this bond and they seem to have fate on their side. It's not until Matilda becomes a part of their story where catharsis takes place. It's when she welcomes the both of them, and when Carmen has this graceful dance with her, where Carmen she's finally able to grieve her mother. And I think there's something really beautiful here where Carmen's mother, as she's dying, claims that if she's Carmen's heart, then Matilda is her spine. And it's not until Carmen finds that backbone of support where she can begin to cope. Something that I think is really affecting. So that initial ruggedness in Carmen that we see through a lot of this film, really, even though she starts to open up, become a little vulnerable with Aiden, it's not until that moment with Matilda where the floodgates open for her. And so what you're talking about there with Barrera's performance, I find so goddamn graceful in this film. And I was very moved by it. And I think there's some really great subtleties in her performance. This is not even close. This is by far her best performance. And
I still give Scream 6. Slightly Scream 6 for me.
It's not even close. Like the dancing and choreography, that alone blows
that's the thing. Yeah, because I think in those moments she is absolutely incredible. I think the physicality of that performance is wonderful.
Really great. That catharsis she has with Matilda, I think, is so striking. And I think
Matilda's doing all the work for her.
I disagree. Barrera is doing as much of the heavy lifting there.
I didn't see it.
And it has to be the both of them. Otherwise, that moment is really flat. And I just don't think so.
I think you can have one performance elevate the other in a moment like that. And I think that's what mostly happens.
I mean, given the over emotion there in Carmen, I think it would come off very manufactured if Barrera isn't very good there.
I think without Matilda, that is manufactured. I think that performance in a vacuum in that moment without Matilda there to back her up did feel kind of manufactured to me. What Matilda was doing to help complement and almost provide commentary for that performance is what saved it for me.
Yeah, so I disagree wholeheartedly, I guess.
Okay.
And I love De Palma in this film and in that moment.
Yeah.
But what I love about what the film is building through the Carmen character, again, poetically, not conventionally, I will echo that a bazillion times because I do love how the film does that here. And with Barrera's performance, I think she's so striking in how she's able to emote through choreography, through dancing, through singing, through these artistic expressions, that when that emotion comes, like that alone earns the moment, let alone what Matilda brings to it. But I think Matilda's presence, being that backbone, being that spine, if you will, I think that amplifies the moment all the more. So I do think the film gets to have its cake and eat it too. You remove Matilda, I think the poeticism and the mythical nature of the film and the physicality of Barrera's performance, that is so elegant and evocative on its own that it works. But you add in this other presence, this spine, if you will, this backbone, and I think it becomes something else entirely, which is what I find so fascinating about that idea of closure here, because, we've talked about closure a lot, but I think it's interesting to talk about maybe the specificities of closure and how maybe that is hard to achieve when you don't have a backbone there. And Aiden isn't providing that for Carmen. It's not until she has that moment with Matilda where she's finally able to let go and grieve. And I just find it so beautiful.
I think many things here are working in her favor as well. This is one of those movies that even if the performance, let me be clear, I don't think her performance is bad. I think there are just elements when she's not focused on the physicality or the choreography or the musicality of it all. When it's just two characters talking to each other and she's involved in that, there was something missing for me. But it's one of those examples that there are attributes within this movie from a filmmaking standpoint that can really do the right thing and heighten what needs to be heightened. Because a lot of what you're saying about the film's themes on closure, I still mostly felt that by the end. And it's primarily because of how all of these other attributes are working in her favor and really working in everyone's favor. It's not just Melissa Barrera, but every performance in this movie is in many ways, they are at the service of Benjamin Millepied and everyone working behind the camera, which is not a bad thing. That's not a problem. Like, that's what this movie is ultimately doing. The people behind the camera are really more so the main characters.
The
in a lot of ways.
technicalities are the star of this movie.
They are.
for sure.
They are. And they are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. I just felt like I noticed a little more stiffness than I would have cared for in those moments when the filmmakers did take a slight backseat, at least with regard to Melissa Barrera's performance. But that's not to say I think her performance is bad, because I don't. When she is focused on the musicality and she's not speaking, but maybe even singing or not even doing anything, there is a lot of emotion there, and I think she's very good at conveying that. So I don't know, maybe it's the dialogue itself not working for me. Maybe it is her performance in the dialogue. I don't know, like, but there was something missing in some of those smaller sequences there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the dialogue is the weakest element of the film, but again, I don't think that it's bad. It's just not the emphasis of this movie, because it's functioning primarily as this poem. I mean, there's moments where we see characters engaging in what seems like conventional dialogue, and then the very next moment, characters are dancing in the middle of the street, and they're at a Texas fair all of a sudden. And they're like, how did we get here? And that's the rhythms of this film I absolutely love. And what does all of that mean? I think there's a lot to parse there in terms of that emotional evolution. And I do think that is really important to emphasize in terms of Carmen and how she emotes in this film, because 90% of her performance and how she emotes is through artistry, dancing, singing, whatever it may be. Very, very little does she do in this film that involves conventional dialogue. And especially just a good old-fashioned and shot reverse shot. I don't even know if we see one in this film. Or if we do, they're very far and few in between.
Weirdly, the closest I think we ever get to one is when there is no dialogue, and it's a shot reverse shot of Aiden and Carmen before they really know each other in the pickup truck, right? When they're just sitting in the front seat together. Yeah, but that's probably the closest example I can think of that is a very literal shot reverse shot, but ironically has no dialogue. And weirdly, I guess because it was dialogue free, I actually kind of felt where the film was going emotionally in that moment between those two characters. So maybe that just further proves my point that, well, at least with my experience with the film, I was more emotionally enamored by what the film was doing aesthetically to carry those emotional beats.
And that's still 95% of this movie. There's very little dialogue here. And
maybe more like 90, but still, it's most of the movie.
We're arguing about 10% of the movie. Like, come on.
I just want to get away from hyperbole, but yeah, I mean, it's semantics at this point. You're right.
Yeah, we're talking about 10% of this film. Which again, I don't know how to make that any more crystal clear that the majority of this film is Millepied, but presented in a unique way that I can only describe as Millepied, taking that form
it's
of
a ballet.
art and kind of
we talked about it earlier. This movie
it's
a ballet. It absolutely is.
And I love that level of poeticism here. It really, if I had any criticism to this film whatsoever, is that I think there's so much to parse as to what's really happening from moment to moment, like as characters make certain choices, or they they have a brief conversation that lasts 30 seconds, and then the next thing we know, we're having some sort of ballet in the middle of the street, or what does all of that truly mean? I think can be a little overwhelming, and from an editing perspective, I don't know if it all works. So that would be kind of my biggest, and I hate to use the word criticism because it's more of a question or a reservation more than anything else.
Sure.
But I love that. Like you opened up all of this about ambition, like taking these big swings. That's what this film does.
Yeah.
And it mostly lands for me, despite any sort of reservations I have. And I do love that the emotional evolution of this film comes through in that artistry and in the subtlety of these performances, despite a few lines of dialogue they say about every 18 minutes.
Well, and,
You know
and
what I
even
mean?
from an editing standpoint, even if it didn't all land, and again, I'm with you. I'm not sure if it all does, but each individual component is so good in a vacuum. I almost didn't really care. In fact, in a weird way, I kind of preferred if the seamlessness of it all wasn't really all that great because it allowed the individual components to just be heightened all the more. So when we actually get this mini ballet sequence in the middle of nowhere, for instance, this random fair that these characters trip upon, and then all of a sudden they just start dancing because why not?
Yeah.
But if you
Full
just
on ballet in the middle of the room.
but you take that ballet sequence out and you just judge it on its own terms, it's exactly what we always ask for in modern musicals these days, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so I can't help but feel like I have to praise it, even if it maybe doesn't like fit within the film in its totality. I guess you can argue in that way, but sometimes it's not meant to. Sometimes you just have to kind of roll with the vibe.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this film mostly does that. Like I said, I think I would have been able to vibe with it more consistently if the dialogue was less. I mean, it's not often, but if this were maybe a silent film, I think I could have got even more on its wavelength more quickly. But those moments are too good to ignore that I just can't help but feel that I came out in the end positive regardless.
Yeah, and I still maintain that the ruggedness we've seen in Barrera's performance is very purposeful. I do think she's meant to be this emotionally, I don't know how to describe, like this emotionally tepid person that is getting to Texas and then maybe ultimately to California. Like, I think she's holding in a lot of it. Like, there's maybe an early catharsis, you could argue, when she throws like when she creates the fire on the house and she burns the house down or whatever. But even that is done through a lot of subtlety. There's not like a palpable anger. There's no over emotion. When she meets up with Aiden for the first time, there's some trepidation, perhaps. She can't trust this guy. She doesn't know him. But again, there's nothing overt in terms of her anger and grief. That does not come through until we get to some of the dance numbers later on in the film, and that moment in particular that we talked about earlier with Matilda.
And I don't disagree. And maybe the difference is I feel like there's a big difference between, and this might sound a bit harsh, and I don't mean to say that this is a reflection of her performance, but there are minor moments every now and then where I did feel this way. There's a difference between ruggedness and expressionless. And I was leaning more towards the latter in those moments, and almost emptiness, honestly.
And I see that as a good thing. I see that as a positive for her performance here.
But see, you have to be able to sense the holding back of emotion, and I felt no sense of anything, honestly. And at least in those minor moments. But again, we're talking about if you add those moments up that I have a few issues with her performance, it might be 4 minutes of screen time or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 45 seconds of screen time we're arguing about.
Again, back to hyperbole. I see what you're doing here.
But the point is, it's such a small slice of the pie when everything else is so gigantic and great. And I think that's, circling back to the direction of this film that I really love, because the balancing of tones here is incredible, because it's both glossy with this gritty realism at times. It's grounded and mythical. It's sensible and poetic. Like, Millepied is able to manage, these clashing of tones and aesthetics in a way that I think is... it's somehow emotionally seductive, but also operatic. And I don't know how he pulls that off. And that to me is maybe where it's a little different than Malick. Malick tends to lean toward kind of this. He's certainly more lyrical and operatic through almost the entirety of his movies.
Right.
Although at times, especially with something like The Tree of Life or A Hidden Life, I think maybe he's able to get a little bit more to that, emotional groundedness at times.
Yeah.
But this film is very much balancing that a little bit more than Malick does. And I think it's absolutely blistering, especially with how pulsating this film is and its dance numbers. And not just the one in the streets, but all the other numbers we see at the end in the club. I think are equally gorgeous.
Oh, there's a hip hop number here too. We didn't even mention that.
Yeah, which is great, and I love the general eroticism of this film and the romanticism of it all, and Bertel's score. We haven't really talked about it. We've argued so much about Barrera that we've barely touched on one of the best scores of the year.
Nicholas
it's
Bertel.
so
He's good at his job. He's good at his job.
It's so good. It's very angelic. Like there's a choir that he utilizes throughout a lot of this film. I mean, I can't really articulate it in the ways that maybe Brendan or other musicians can, but I think the score here very, very much adds to the fundamental poeticism that this film is carrying through.
I would agree.
It,
so.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts you have on Carmen? Should we argue some more?
We don't need to argue some more, but I do at least want to say once again, yes, there is a hip hop number in this movie, and it's probably the closest that something has come to feeling out of place in the movie, and yet somehow it absolutely worked for me. And again, maybe it's just the ambition of it and me appreciating the overall ambition of it, because it's actually surprisingly vulgar in its lyricism.
Sure.
Which took me off guard. It's
the timing of it was weird.
Well, yeah. I mean, we talk about Melissa Barrera. She was obviously in The Heights, which was a product from Lin-Manuel Miranda, who's sort of known for infusing his musicals with a hip hop mentality. The hip hop scene in Carmen is nothing like Lin-Manuel Miranda at all. It's very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
Yes.
Certainly more aggressive. It would probably carry that parental advisory sticker if you saw the album on vinyl or CD somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, it took me by surprise, and yet somehow I was kind of hypnotized by it. And maybe I just thought the groove of it was really catchy. I don't know. So maybe that was certainly helping too.
And again, like I just love the weird timing of it, right? Because it comes off this moment of bravado that that involves Paul Mescal, and then somehow we get into this elegant but crass hip hop number all at the same time. Like it's just so strange.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't all work, I love the swing. Like I love
the swing
that kind of ambition, and I had a lot of fun with it. I thought it was really great. Like
sure.
Really fantastic stuff. I guess as far as a final thought though, circling back to what I loved about the closure of this film, and I am a sucker for it. I'll take it any way you can give it to me. But I do love how this film takes that idea that I love broadly and gives it some specificity, as I talked about earlier with Matilda being this backbone.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting idea. And then we get that moment of catharsis from Carmen where she's finally able to grieve. And then this film hits you, because it is a tragedy after all, with this irony where after Carmen is maybe a little invigorated after that sense of healing she gets with Matilda, tragedy strikes at the end of this film, and we get this final dance number that I just find jaw-dropping. Like it's just a stunner.
That again is like where I think the film is at its best in all ways, not just as a filmmaking piece and as a musical experiment, but even as a performative piece. I think it's just as great in those regards in that moment too.
I agree. I love it. There are some, I guess you could say, ambiguity, but maybe less ambiguity than what we had seen earlier in the film.
I think it's ambiguous in the sense that we're never told what actually happens, but visually, it's pretty implied. It's pretty implied.
You understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Either way, whether it's ambiguous or not, again, it maintains that ethereal, mythical poeticism that the film carries throughout a lot of the film. And I just think that coupled with the music and the performances there, it's a stunner, absolutely stunner of an ending. So I really like this film a lot. I still need to think through the film, because right now I am utterly enamored with these performances and the score, which I have not stopped listening to.
Sure.
And just the filmmaking, the lush cinematography. Like this is going to be another one of those films that does not get nominated for best cinematography, and you sit here and wonder, what is the point of awards? Like, what is the purpose of it?
I
when
feel like
films
this one
like
might
this get lost.
I feel like this one might get lost, sadly. I just don't think there's enough talk around it.
No.
And we know that, I mean, if the Oscars do still happen next year, we do know that the Academy tends to respond to marketing campaigns when the talk helps
That's it.
elevate it. And I think that's where Carmen is going to get forgotten. I just don't think there's going to be enough talk.
Zero marketing for this movie. Zero.
Why can't critics just be members of the Academy? Like the only members of the Academy.
Like, I just want there to be a way where there's a level of objectivity here. Because
here's what we do. We sell the Academy the In-Session Film Awards.
Yeah.
And just say, here you go. This is your ceremony.
Yeah, exactly.
We pick the winners.
Absolutely. Because handing out an award for best marketing is not interesting to me fundamentally. I understand that's how the game is played. And look, I'm not necessarily against the Oscars. I just vehemently oppose the idea of turning art into sports. But if we do it more objectively, where, hey, we're talking about the best cinematography of the year, we're talking about best score, you cannot look at me in the eye with a straight face and tell me that in terms of cinematography and score, this film should not be in that conversation. Give me a break. There's absolutely no way on this planet Earth where that should happen in an objective sense. Now, in the world of marketing, and this film's never going to have the funds to promote itself, and therefore it's not going to get voted for, sure, I understand it. But in an objective world, this film is absolutely a contender for those two awards at the very least.
Yeah.
But, it's not going to happen because...
In-Session Film Awards, baby. It's what it's all about.
Absolutely. Anyway, thanks for listening to my TED Talk.
I was going to say,
We'll
that was
be back here
powerful.
next week.
That was powerful. Most TED Talks make people cry. That got very close for me.
Yeah. At any rate, let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. It's very interesting. Brendan and I don't always get into debates. So I find it a little funny that not only did we finally have some sort of debate here, but it was on 45 seconds of the movie.
Oh, that's very common, JD. Doesn't that when we find something to disagree about, it's usually something very inconsequential. But we hone in on that because it changes our dynamic for a moment, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're not used to really disagreeing with each other. And when we find that moment, it's like, oh, we're fishing. We're catching that sucker right now. We're going.
We have to take it for all it's worth.
Yeah.
That to me is just really funny. But at any rate, let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. Facebook, Twitter, we'll continue to call it that. Instagram, what else? Blue Sky, Threads, either way. Hit us up. Or again, we're on YouTube as well. Leave a comment
right here
below, like, subscribe, all that fun jazz that they tell you to do.
Pointing
on
to
YouTube.
JD right there. Yeah. So.
Let us know what you think of this. And I think that's it. Brendan, do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Nope. I am very curious to, research the original opera that this was based on now.
Yeah, I'd be curious too.
Because like I said, I know some of the themes from it because they've been referenced in other movies and other properties over the years. So I know some more about it than I probably know right now this second. So I'm genuinely curious about that. And from what you said and from what I know as well, I know that Benjamin Millepied took a lot of liberties and more or less readapted it in a very literal way.
Yes.
So it's very different.
Yeah, that's from all the reading that I did on this film. It seems as if like a basic outline is there from the original opera, and then he very much modernized it. The characters, the relationships are just very different. So he made it his own. And as much as I compare this to Malick, and I probably didn't do a great job of articulating this, it is very Malickian, but also its own thing. Like, I don't think it's a verbatim copy.
No.
But I love it. I was utterly engrossed by the entire thing. even if it doesn't all work. And I honestly, I still don't know. It's poeticism. I'm still wrapping my head around. So.
Oh, it's and it's not a movie we can outright recommend, right?
No.
And
No, it's
you notice
hard.
we were very careful not to say whether we think people should see it or not. It was just our interpretation because this movie is not going to be for everyone. It's for those who go by Metacritic scores specifically. I think this is rocking a 59 out of 100 right now, which honestly does not surprise me. Like that
makes sense to
feels
me.
kind of that tracks for this kind of movie.
I agree. I totally see why people don't like this movie because it's functioning in its own atmosphere, and you either vibe with it or you might have a really hard time. But I obviously did. You give me great lush visuals and an electric score like we get from Bertel, and then these performances, and I'm there. Like I'm good,
Right.
especially with this kind of ambition and the kind of swings this goes for. Like, yeah, I mean, you've hooked me. Like I'm
go.
totally with it. So, but I get it. I get why others wouldn't. But if anything we had to say here is interesting, it is on demand right now, so you can go and see it.
Absolutely.
At any rate, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Mescal. Great to see him again.